Banga, the chief guest. Normally we have this function at 4 p.m. Indian time, but we were keen to have a scholar of Professor Mark standing to chair this important lecture. So I contacted him. He readily agreed. And then I learned he has to go in for his surgery. He said, never mind, I'll be back from the hospital. There he is. That shows his love, not only for Punjab, but also his indulgence for our friends. He never says no to us. We're grateful. Last minute, I requested Professor Banga. She agreed. Thankful. And Professor Harish Puri is my family elder. He can't say no anyway. Now, if I remember correctly, there is huge files of Ghadar papers in Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley. I think Mark was the first to discover those papers when he was working as a young research assistant to Khushwant Singh, who was then doing his 2-volume History of the Sikhs. Professor Harish Puri consulted those papers because he was doing the research, doctoral research on the Ghadar movement, and then he published his volume, which remains the most authoritative book on the subject. Now, I remember many meaningful meetings with the 3 distinguished scholars who have joined with us. They are great in their own respective fields. One thing they have in common is that they carry their eminence very lightly. I mean, they are big people, but I'm glad they deal with their students, with their friends in a very human way. I'm grateful. We all know, if I go through the biodata of these scholars, I think it will take a lot of time. They are all well-established scholars with dozens of books, research papers. They have traveled in and given lectures in various Indian and foreign universities. And what is important is they have trained a group of students. That's more important. I especially remember Professor Banga in the University Guest House in Patiala till midnight, checking the pronunciation of students, which is missing these days. You can then repeat again. It looks embarrassing these days. You can't tell your student. But this is, I think, achievement that all these 3 people, the chair, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, Professor Harish Puri, Professor Banga, they train students very affectionately and very efficiently and build a sort of school which is missing these days. We all know Professor Mark Juergensmeyer was the first to introduce Sikh studies in California, beginning in 1976, I believe. Yes. The first Sikh Studies Conference with the help of our Dr. Narinder Singh Kapani. That volume was published in 78. My first official contact with Mark was when he was coordinating for the 20th Century Sikhism Conference in University of Toronto in 1987, I believe. It was there that I first time physically met him. Professor Garewal, Professor Banga, Dr. Amritsar Singh, others also joined. And then there was some law that you had to visit and do some post-conference in California also. So we had a post-conference in Berkeley. There onwards, there have been many exchanges. Mark has been almost every year visiting us, speaking, chairing, participating in seminars on Guru Gobind Singh, seminars on Guru Nanak, and last was he delivered a memorial lecture for Professor Ban Singh on his first birth centenary. Professor Harish Puri delivered lectures in our institute, and Professor Puri, Professor Garewal, Professor Banga, they are founders of our institute, and I always get their academic support and help. Now, if you permit me to, I'd like to say and repeat it again. Sikh community owes a special thanks to Mark, not only that he organized the first ever conference on Sikh studies, he also managed to create first chair of Sikh studies in Santa Barbara, Kundan Kaur Kapani chair of Sikh studies, and more chairs have followed. Thanks, Mark. We are grateful to you. Now, last week we discussed Dr. Kapani's memoirs, The Man Who Bent Light, and Dr. Kamaljeet Singh Anand, Sonia Dami, and Rupinder Singh earlier from the Tribune. They were the discussants. So our institute is doing small work to continue working on Punjab, even these difficult times, COVID and other disruptions. We're doing online. I think there's one advantage of online. The friends whom we cannot easily meet, who meet on this platform. So I'm thankful to you all for having found time and joined us. Now I request the chair, Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, to invite Professor Puri to give this morning and evening in California, this morning or evening's lecture. Over to Professor Mark Juergensmeyer.
Well, thank you very much, Mohinder. It's a great honor to chair this session where we're going to hear, I'm sure, just an excellent talk by Professor Harish Puri on a subject for which he is acknowledged to be the world's foremost authority. And it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. You know, Mohinder and Harish and Indubanga, I've known you folks just forever, going back to many years ago when I lived and taught in the Punjab and taught at Punjab University. And so I really feel like I'm coming back to joining family. It's a real honor. But my friendship with Harish, I think, was really sealed over the subject that is the topic of tonight's discussion. Because as Mohinder said, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, there was this huge box of materials that was left by Khushwant Singh. I was kind of designated to be the steward of it. And because I had lived in the Punjab, I knew something about the Punjab, but I didn't know anything about this movement. And I was just thrilled and amazed to discover that this foremost movement for India's freedom was created right in California, where I was a graduate student, from students who were at Berkeley and at Stanford and who were farmers out in the San Joaquin Valley, and that the materials related to that movement, many of them were still in the Gurdwara in Stockton, where many of the people who are associated with the movement had been parishioners. So with some other graduate students and with a small amount of money from the library, we embarked on a mission to rescue those materials, literally saving them from the termites in some cases. We had to fumigate the materials when we got them back to Berkeley. And then, of course, we gave them to the library and they created a special Ghadar memorial collection. Alas, as a scholar, I didn't do much with the materials. I think I wrote one essay. I turned my attention to other aspects of Punjab society for my dissertation and in my work since then. But fortunately, there was an even better scholar than me who came along to make good use of that material, and that was Harish Puri. So I was thrilled that someone of his quality and his insight and his ability to make reasoned intellectual and sound judgments about the veracity of the material could put this material together into good use in a comprehensive, now series of books on the Ghadar movement. And Harish is the person that I always go to when wanting to ask about things Ghadar. He has saved me from embarrassing mistakes that I've made in talking about Ghadar on more than one occasion. And so I'm very pleased to introduce not just an old friend, but also a great resource and a mentor, the world's greatest scholar on the Ghadar movement, who will enlighten us today. Harish, it's such a pleasure to have you here and to have Indu Bunga, a great historian of the Punjab, who will comment after your remarks.
Well,
Welcome, sir.
thanks a lot, Mark. Very affectionate words. I'm sure actually I couldn't have done any good work without the ground prepared by you. The kind of material you made available to me. Even on my visit later, you helped me to collect material from St. Bruno archives, and also supplied me with the money. Photocopies made, leaving one copy with you and one for myself.
Yes.
And I've thoroughly enjoyed your guidance, your love for a very long time. It's almost 50 years almost 50 years now.
Yes.
It is delightful meeting you, and delightful that I'm speaking when you are in the chair. And, of course, Professor Banga has been a family friend, a great scholar, and we have shared a lot. This is great pleasure having you, Professor Banga, here, and Dr. Mahinder Singh. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks a lot for initiating this series of talks on various aspects of the freedom struggle, because we are celebrating now the 75th anniversary of India's independence. So this is one of the lectures in that series. I thought much has been written and discussed on the Ghadar, the history of the Ghadar movement and ideology and organization, etc. I thought let me look at how the Ghadar movement was viewed by the coming generations and the young people and the contemporaries, and what is it which they could consider as their inheritance, heritage coming from the Ghadar movement. So from that angle, I would like to view its impact. Normally, it's the cultural impact of the movement is definitely more important. But for most of us, I think, who are attending or listening to this talk, must be quite aware of what Ghadar movement was. I don't have to repeat those things. But a few things are important. One, the very name itself. When for the first time, Ghadar Hardyal, in the meeting of Indian migrants there, workers, thought of starting a newspaper as a propaganda paper. There was a question of what should be its name. And when this name was suggested and accepted, Ghadar. Now, Ghadar actually sent a chill of fright in the British people. The very choice meant a kind of warning to the British, be scared, now we are coming. We are going to deal with you. Earlier in 1907, Savarkar had organized the anniversary of the 1857 revolt, called it Indian War of Independence. And there, right in London, he had also said that so far we have not been able to achieve what the martyrs of 1857 tried to achieve, we have so far not been able, but we assure our martyrs that by the diamond jubilee of that is about 1917, we should sure throw the British out of India. Now, right from that time, we find that the British intelligence agencies were put on job to keep an eye on Indians abroad. So, right in 1908, we find efforts being made to stop the entry of Indians to Canada and America, Canada in particular, America a little later. Why? Because the reports were that in this free atmosphere, they seem to learn about what freedom is. And we have a number of anarchist and socialist thinkers and activists moving around. And these people who come from the military strata, the peasantry from Punjab, they might get infected by those ideas. Infected was a word used by the CID. Ideas of liberty and equality, and they might create trouble. So the provision that nobody could come to Canada unless it is by a continuous journey from India itself was selected by Lord Minto himself to ensure that Indian entry into Canada should be stopped. And Lord Bryce was then British ambassador to USA. He approached the American government that you do likewise. It was started later. My point is that when the Ghadar movement started, the very choice of the word meant more to the British, more as a warning to the British, as a thunderbolt to the British, that we are organizing a movement for an armed struggle against you. And since the people who were there were from the military strata, and the British Empire depended a lot on the loyalty and the great service by Sikh soldiers of Punjab, they were really scared. Now, if we read, for example, the first issue of the Ghadar, it says that we have started a paper, and this starts a new epoch in the history of India. It was underlined that today we forged an instrument to liberate the Indian brothers from the shackles of slavery. Therefore, the government has turned pale. So what they enjoyed was that now our aim is to frighten the British. You cannot anymore have a peaceful rule. Our name and our work, they said, today there begins in foreign lands, but in the language of the country, a war against the English rule in India. And on the headmast of every issue was written, enemy of the British, enemy of English Raj. And in the very first, since they had to educate their own people, most of them were rather illiterate, and newspaper was only read out to them. The question they answered was, what is our name? So the first article itself is, what is our name? Ghadar. And what does our work consist of? Launching Ghadar. The name of the objective, the name and the objective are one and the same. we are going to launch an other mutiny kind of armed insurrection in India, just like that of 1857. Where will this Ghadar break out? In India. When will that happen? In a few years. Why should it be started? Because the people can no longer bear the oppression and tyranny unleashed under British rule. On the top of the Punjabi version, started on 9th of December, was a saying from Guru Nanak, Jai tau prem khelan ka chao, sir tar tali gali meri aao. If you wish to play the game of love, enter my lane with the head on your palm. It embodies the idea of a firm resolve to fight unto death. Now, if we see the whole picture of the framework of ideas in their mind, it was that since India has been under the British rule, our wealth has been plundered. There is extreme poverty, there have been famines. And in famines alone, 20 million people died in the last 20 years, that is from 1893 to 1913. And foreigners have loaded away our country using our wealth. They hit us hard. How shall we survive as slaves forever? Now think, shall we suffer hunger and insults forever? In America, our eyes have opened. And Bhai Jwala Singh actually used the Punjabi term. He said, America vich aake aise aadmi ho gaye. For the first time, we realized what being humans means, the kind of freedom enjoyed here. Mm-hmm. We have been serving the oppressor by joining their armies. That is no good. We have to understand the meaning of slavery and freedom. They preached simplicity of character, the need for an egalitarian society, and also getting rid of the influence of variety of religious leaders, priests. We don't need these priests. We don't need these mullahs. The first thing is, for our dignity, that we must be independent and the British rule must end. With simple to understand exhortations. No pandits or mullahs do we need. What is important is our ghairat, dignity, prestige, with the audacity of hope and intense patriotism. They talked of heritage of Bell, advocated some kind of secularism, opposition to communalism and sectarianism. Big idea of the desired social order. They would say, for example, Nama Roop Rachan Hind De Samaj, to create a new kind of secular, democratic, egalitarian kind of a society, a new shape of this country. We need to throw the British out. Tukham udana, zalma de rajda. And for that, you will have to struggle, and the struggle will be violent. And the struggle, it's likely that you may die. it was better to die in this struggle for freedom rather than live like a slave. Liquidating the enemy or dying in the struggle. Let us take the yoke of slavery off our neck. This was the kind of message. We know that this was the first of its kind movement where a few thousand people, natives of India, organized themselves and came from outside to liberate the country. I am not aware of any other such instance in history where an organized force, or semi-organized, if not organized, coming from outside to liberate their country. And this was the first such effort where they had some kind of a vague conception of complete independence, whereby they would have a society in which there would be a wonderful education, there would be equality, there would be social justice, people would be sensitive, and they also dreamt of people of high character. And the people who joined at that point of time have been actually described as pious rebels. You know, Son Singh Bhakna, for example, would say that by now patriotism was our religion. Sant Vasakha Singh would say patriotism is even better than the love of God. Now, this kind of intense feeling of love for the country, these were the people who actually went from the village almost straight to foreign countries. Many of them had not even gone to a town. They were not familiar with what India really is. But now they were conceptualizing themselves and called each other Hindi, Indian, Hindustani. And they very rarely talked about Punjabi, or of course they said the Punjabis and Bengalis and Marathis must get together. But otherwise, they did not identify themselves even as Sikhs or Punjabis. They would always wish to be identified as Hindi, Hindustani. So this kind of a change came, and when they, obviously they were not prepared because the First World War started. They had been working only for a few months, 8 or 9 months. Hardyal had worked only for 4 months. He left in April. And when the war started, they were just not prepared. But the question was, shall we sit silent? They had some kind of a conception that maybe in 1917 or in 1920 we would launch this kind of Ghadar, an armed insurrection. Nobody was prepared in 1914. But the question was that when they had a gathering at Stockton, the passion for not letting the chance go, because the idea was that the British forces in India would be moving out to the centers of war elsewhere in Europe. And that is the correct time to go there. And we know that when they came to India, they were not prepared. They didn't have arms. And right in the entry, they were arrested. And Lahore conspiracy trial and several other trials led to a large number of convictions. Some 279 Ghadarites were tried in these. And very high number of people executed. 46 were punished to death, 69 to life imprisonment in cellular jail of Komaghatamaru. And soldiers of the 23rd Cavalry were shot through court-martial. In a sense, one could say the movement failed to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Surely, in the military sense, one could say it was a failure. One could also say that it was failure in the other sense that they were not properly planned. They were not organized. And surely, they didn't have any idea of how powerful the British Army and the British forces are. Actually, come to see, if you go into the depth, it seems at that point of time, the British government and British intelligence services knew much more about the Ghadarite themselves than they perhaps knew about each other because of their scare. And they were really prepared to crush it. And they succeeded. And then you had the Justice Rowlatt Committee to go into investigate the revolutionary movements and how we can nip it nip the evil in the bud, so that later on we don't have a problem. And the result was the Rowlatt Acts and Jallianwala Bagh. Now, my thinking is that one of the most important legacies, though very indirect, of the Ghadar movement was the fallout in the Jallianwala Bagh. Actually, in 1920, Govind Bihari Lal, who was a cousin of Hardyal, by chance met one officer, James Houseman Dubeloy. He was a personal assistant brought by Lord Hardinge along with himself when he came to India in 1910. And he was advisor to the Viceroy and Governor General of India and Secretary Government of India's Home Department during that period, 1915. He by chance met Govind Bihari Lal. And he said during discussions, since the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy had happened, he raised this point about what did he think of it. So Dubeloy, G.V. Lal says that Dubeloy startled him by saying that Amritsar massacre could be traced to your Ghadar movement. Now this is understandable because throughout the Ghadar newspaper and their speeches, pamphlets, and particularly very rich poetry, which incites, it was getting translated. Actually, one senior officer, Deputy Director of Intelligence, was put on job to prepare records of any revolutionary activities connected with the mutiny of 1857. James Campbell Kerr then wrote a book, Political Trouble in India, and he writes in the introduction that we were assigned this job that the people in India have not forgotten the 1857 mutiny, and they want to repeat the same thing again. In 1897, there were some terrorist activities in Maharashtra. In 1907, a great important meeting, which was dramatic and theatrical in London. And we had the Ajit Singh's movement here, where the fear, the commander-in-chief had to intervene and advise Lord Minto to veto the bill because lot number of army people seemed to be coming to political meetings, and this could really create a danger because the threat of repetition of 1857 was there. So when Ghadar movement was organized, they had collected all the material about what they wanted to do, and they had their spies right among the passengers to report to the CID. And O'Dwyer writes that actually he was being regularly informed about what these people were talking about. And this is what led to the first impact on Komakata Maru, for example, that the passengers were not allowed to land there. And in Calcutta, the police looked upon the passengers as some kind of demons, you know, and there was firing and people were killed there. So one can see the kind of fear. And we find that when a powerful colonial state, an empire ruling over a major part of the world, when it's haunted by fear, the specter of fear in the mind of powerful armed person can be very dangerous. When Kim Wagner, for example, when he wrote this book on Jallianwala Bagh, its subtitle was An Empire of Fear and the Making of the Amritsar Massacre. White power was there and also vulnerability at the same time. Fear as if entrenched in the soul. Dalrymple, for example, you know, talked about the British, in British conversation, the word used by the British press also was annihilation of demons. That such people are demons, they have to be annihilated. And Dalrymple actually makes a reference to E.M. Foster's Passage to India, where one character tells that any civil servant coming to India from England was advised to read mutiny papers. Because the massacre during that period in Bibighar, in Kanpur particularly, where hundreds of women and British children were butchered by mobs of so-called rebels. This was horrendous. And they wanted that every single person coming from England to serve in India should or must read the mutiny papers to know what Indians are like. The word, for example, one character uses this, when an Indian goes bad, he goes not only very bad, but very queer, like some kind of rabid pet. They're perfectly capable of deceitfully hiding their true intentions and emotional state of mind. Read any of the mutiny record. This should be your Bible in the country. So one can understand that with this kind of fear entrenched deep in the mind of the imperial government and the men like O'Dwyer and General Dyer, when a political upsurge happened because of Gandhian call to protest against the road tax, This is what, General Dyer's statement before the Hunter Committee is evident. He said, well, of course, there is no regret. I'm glad I performed my duty. I had to teach them a lesson because otherwise, God knows what might have happened. And, principal of Khalsa College that at that point of time was Jared Wathen. And he said in one of the meetings, I was startled when strategy was being discussed among the officers about how to deal with the crowd in Amritsar after the Ram Navami, the procession, and whatever happened in the Hall Bazaar, the sort of some banks set on fire and some Europeans, 3 or 4 killed. He said one of the persons discussing the strategy said, we should bombard Amritsar. He said, I was startled. And he said, I went to a cantonment and found British women hugging their children and crying publicly, fearing what might happen tomorrow, remembering what happened in Kanpur. So I feel that, one of the indirect kind of legacies of Ghadar movement was the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh. And Jallianwala Bagh, of course, became a watershed in the Indian freedom struggle. And it had its own further consequences and effects. For its direct impact on India, I was thinking that I should focus more upon Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh, one is that Bhagat Singh was easily one of the closest closest from India, from here, to the Ghadarites. Kartar Singh Sraba, for example, was taken to be his hero. He was at that point of time only 8 years or so, Bhagat Singh. But he knew it was talked in the family, and Kishan Singh, his father, had given them some money also. And Bhai Parmanand, who was a Ghadarite, was close friend of Hardyal and was there in the first meeting in Astoria. He was the teacher of Bhagat Singh. And Bhagat Singh had met Bhai Randir Singh, for example, had met Son Singh Phakna in the jail. So he was quite familiar with the Ghadar, and he was quite inspired by the Ghadar movement and Kartar Singh Sraba in particular. And so one could see how Ghadar impacted the thinking and behavior and attitudes of Bhagat Singh, and how Bhagat Singh as a role model is influencing a number of other people until this day. There is another reason also, that Ghadarites were not thinkers. They were passionate revolutionaries of will, despite knowing that they were not prepared, that they had no means. They had that passion, but they were not thinkers. They were not planners. They were not real organizers. The people who were with them, the students who could have done it, like say Tarak Nath Das or Jitendra Nath Das and others, they had moved away. Hardyal had left already, and Hardyal ideas had undergone a change. The one word which was common among the Ghadarites was Sanu Rajniti wala gyan koi kyun nahi? Why don't we have the knowledge or intelligence about politics? Now, politics they knew that it requires intelligence, and that they don't have the wherewithal, they don't have the information. And they said, for example, while moving out, they would say, "Aao desh bhaiyo Hindustan wale, oh countrymen, brothers from India, let's get together. Let's think seriously about what should be done to end this misery and slavery." So they were pining for it. Come, let us think about it. They were not able to really work out how it needs to be done. Bhagat Singh was an intellectual. So how this intellectual took that message from the Ghadar and how he used that for his purpose, that would be an interesting part of seeing how the Ghadar legacy has impacted. It is known that Bhagat Singh was very close to, for example, Kartar Singh Sarabha and others, and Bhai Santokh Singh, and also the Kirti. And also Sachin Sanyal, for example, who organized the Hindustan Republican Army, who was the first one to write a book on the Ghadarites in Hindi, Bandi Jeevan. Bandi Jeevan was practically a Bible-like thing for the revolutionaries, the close friends and Naujawan Bharat Sabha people. Now, I wish to emphasize upon this, that what was the impact? By 1928, Bhagat Singh and his comrades had written some 54 small biographical accounts of Indian revolutionary martyrs. And out of these, 27 were small biographies of the Ghadarites. Now, tells of the great impact which the courage, the readiness to die, the steadfastness of these people which impressed Bhagat Singh. They provide a fairly good idea of what was up to 1928 in particular, or even a little later though, the impact on Bhagat Singh. I'll read out a few things from the essay, the biographical account of Kartar Singh Sarabha, which will give some idea to us of the very language which expresses the sentiment. He said the Ghadar party was composed of those who offered their heads at the altar of the goddess of freedom. Like a hurricane, they came from somewhere, stoked the fire of rebellion, and were ultimately themselves consumed by it. They were self-sacrificing. One is amazed to think of what at the age of 19 he was able to do. Such courage, such self-confidence, so much of self-denial and passionate commitment has never been seen earlier. There have not been many people born in India who could be in real terms described as Bahi, rebels. But among those few leaders, Kartar Singh Sarabha's name is on the top of the list. So his focus was not on what they thought, their ideas, their planning, their organization capabilities. His focus was on their self-sacrificing passion. When Kartar Singh Sarabha was told he would be awarded death sentence, he laughed in the court and he would give preference to Phansi over life imprisonment, so that by taking birth again, Sarabha said, I could offer myself for death sentence again. taking birth again, I'll be executed again, and until India gains freedom, that is my last wish. So Bhagat Singh appreciates this sentiment, the readiness to die for a cause, self-sacrificing. And he says at the end of the article, today again, the question is raised as to what was the advantage of their dying. To what purpose did they die? The answer is straightforward. Revolutionary sentiment ran in every vein of theirs. That was the reason. That is why they died. And he says, he then repeated a small couplet which Ghadar Singh Saraba used to sing. Palaye shahidi sher gaj ke, bani sir sheran de ki jana bhaj ke. Let's attain martyrdom, roaring like a lion. When lions are challenged, why run away from the field? Writing in a similar vein, in the biography of Dr. Mathura Singh, for example, he said, "Ho farishte bhi fida jin pe, ye wo insan hai, for whom even angels would love to sacrifice. Such human beings are these." And they were thus called very pious people. Ajay Ghosh and Sohan Singh Josh, they talk about, how mesmerizing impact of Ghadar Singh Saraba's story was on their mind. So the Bhagat Singh and his comrades in the revolutionary movement, Naujawan Bharat Sabha and Hindustan, later on Socialist Republican Army, they shared this kind of a fascination. But by now, by that time, Bhagat Singh had come to realize that actually it is indispensable quality for a revolutionary to take things critically. Criticism and independent thinking are two indispensable qualities of a revolutionary. So they came to review, what were the weaknesses of the Ghadarites? Why did they fail? They said, besides absence of proper organization, another weakness was the absence of required secrecy in the working of the Ghadarites. Obviously, the emphasis is that now we need to be careful around. And we know that among the revolutionaries, there were rumors of suspicion about one or the other, that somebody may be reporting to the police, maybe an informer. But he said that beside this, the basic point is that there was the ignorance, apathy, and sometimes active opposition of the masses. We know, for example, the Chief Khalsa Diwan, how in the Khalsa Advocate and elsewhere, the Ghadarites were condemned as patit, and the Sikh community was asked to boycott them, that they were un-Sikh, they were not really true Sikhs, etc. And he said, so Bhagat Singh was conscious that what is necessary is that the party, which means his friends, should with work of mass propaganda. It was very essential, and we have to go into the masses. This emphasis becomes important. Two of the most important, learning from critical review of the fate of the Ghadarites, he was drawing a lesson that what we need is a strong organization, an organization which is closer to the people, the masses, the peasants. Sangathan ka Janavadikaran. We need to have an organization which is a people's organization, after placing objectives before them. And Sohan Singh Josh tells, for example, that in the meetings and discussions, Bhagat Singh during those days, when Naujawan Bharat Sabha was organizing activities, one noticed two kinds of trends of ideas about how to go about it. how to go about our work, our revolutionary work. He said one was, which he called a minority opinion, which Bhagat Singh was the advocate of this, supporter of this. He said Bhagat Singh wanted to do something quick through the use of bombs and pistols in order to politically awaken the slumbering youths and students, something spectacular that would make them sit up. And we know whether it is the murder of Saunders or the assembly bomb, the emphasis was correct, the fascination for something theatrical. The second trend was of organizing peasants and workers. And the idea was that when the revolutionary situation becomes mature, then a call would be given to start the revolution. According to Josh, Bhagat Singh was not prepared to wait that long. And Bhagat Singh said, our young hot blood cannot wait for that long. His main line was that a single deed makes more propaganda in a few days than 1,000 pamphlets. And Josh admitted that he himself was also of a similar kind of mind. The Ghadar party ideology of armed struggle and Ghadar heroes' unprecedented sacrifices had a firm hold on my mind, on my thinking. So even I could not advise Bhagat Singh as to what is the right path. So two conflicting imperatives jostle in the mind of Bhagat Singh. For example, the message which Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt sent to the Punjab Students' Conference on October 19, 1929. Now, this is about 2 months before the Congress session to declare complete independence when Jawaharlal Nehru was to address. It stated categorically, now this is the new bent of mind of Bhagat Singh. Today, we cannot ask the youth to take to pistols and bombs. In the coming Lahore session, the Congress is to give a call for a fierce fight for the independence of the country. The youth will have to bear a great burden in this difficult time in the history of the nation. He is totally identifying himself with the national struggle led by the Congress Party. The people, the youth will have to awaken the crore slum dwellers of the industrial areas and villages living in worn out cottages. That was the priority. And they're writing it to the Punjab Students' Conference. But there was in their mind the other imperative also. Now, this was reflected in the opening words of the Manifesto of Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, which was circulated in December 1929 session of the Congress. Now, this is different. It opens the words, the food on which the tender plant of liberty thrives is the blood of the martyr. On December 23, an attempt was also made on the special train of the Viceroy, Lord Edmund. And Gandhi's criticism of that action, Gandhi wrote about the cult of the bomb. It was followed by a rejoinder by Bhagat Singh's party, written by Bhagwati Chand Verma. The philosophy of the bomb was titled. It concluded with the words, we shall have our revenge. A people's righteous revenge on the tyrant. Let cowards fall back and cringe for compromise and peace. Two different kind of ideas simultaneously jostling in the mind of revolutionaries. And we feel that, Bhagat Singh's ideas and world view were definitely far more advanced than that of the other patriots. So whatever is jostling in the mind of these revolutionaries is important. And now Bhagat Singh writes, a few years earlier, we ourselves were supporters of that path, the revolutionary path, the bomb throwing path, the radical Ghadarite kind of path. The lesson we learn from the revolution in the other parts of the world is that this kind of terrorism, instead of helping towards revolution, has proved to be harmful. Sukhdev also wrote a letter like this and questions the utility of such kind of acts. In a more serious kind of study, which he conducted in jail, Bhagat Singh goes over in his mind. And actually, it's almost like brooding on things very seriously. And these astute observations are available in his 3 pamphlets, Why I Am an Atheist, his introduction to the Dreamland written by Ram Saran Das, and his letter to the young worker dated 2nd February 1931. And it says, I began to study. My previous faith and convictions underwent a remarkable modification. The romance of the violent methods alone was not so prominent among our predecessors. Now, no more mysticism, no more blind faith. Realism became our cult. Now, he emphasizes that use of force may be justifiable when resorted as a terrible necessity. Otherwise, non-violence as policy is indispensable for all mass movements. Now he's thinking of mass movements, and for that non-violence was absolutely essential. The revolutionaries know better than anybody else that the socialist society cannot be brought about by violent means. Our movement, he said, is passing through an important phase when, for example, Gandhi was having parleys with Lord Irwin. He wrote, for example, the reference was made to the national political constitutional struggle described as our movement. Gandhian salt satyagraha, in an indirect method, Bhagat Singh owns it as our movement. It's a national struggle. Please do tell me about the time. How much time would you give Dr. Mahinder Singh?
Let the chair decide, or you decide how much you want to sort of sum up.
Oh, I'll need about 15-20 minutes more.
Is it okay or less?
20 minutes is fine.
Huh? Okay.
Is that all right?
Mark is okay?
Can I take about 15 minutes more?
We also want to hear from Indu Bunga, so but we enjoy hearing the presentation by Harish Puri.
Okay.
So whenever you feel.
Now, actually, he now says that he asks his people, leave sentimentalism aside, be prepared to face the facts. Revolution is a very difficult task. And goes on to advise, the program requires at least 20 years for its fulfillment. This is what he's advising his own people. Cast aside your youthful dreams of revolution within 10 years or Gandhi's utopian promise of Swaraj within 1 year. It requires neither the emotion nor the death. For revolutionary cause, it requires neither the emotion nor the death, but the life of constant struggle, suffering, and sacrifice. Crush your individuality first. However, in spite of such clarity, what we find is that the romance of the violent methods and the grandeur of self-sacrifice, the legacy of the Ghadar movement, had a greater hold on his choice. Sarfaroshi ki tamanna. He still, at the last moment, he thinks, my name has become a symbol of revolution. मैं इनकलाब का मूल मंत्र बन गया हूं. I am lucky. Obviously, this decision, after such serious thinking, tells about the hold of Ghadar's legacy on his mind. That he thought, sacrificing the life would serve the cause more than continuing to live and work among the masses to organize them. It seems to me that, martyrdom can sometimes be viewed also as a substitute for organized strength. It can be an escape mechanism. And we find that the people who were influenced by him, Kirtis later on, and particularly the Naxalites, and later on even the Khalistanis. They sought the same kind of institution, because when ideology becomes secondary to personal valor and courage and sacrifice, then he is equally a hero of the Khalistanis and the Naxalites. And they could at the same time honor Sant Bhindranwale and Bhagat Singh. It doesn't really make much of a difference. And we know the Naxalites crossing over into Khalistanis. This is the kind of legacy which directly this movement had. I want to also emphasize that this kind of a thinking also perhaps persuaded the scholars also of history to keep away from a serious study of the linkage between the revolutionaries and the Congress and the Gandhian movement. The denigration of Gandhi was also a result of this kind of legacy of other movement and the choice which was made by Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh himself had a great appreciation for the Gandhian movement, and he was personally very rather friendly advised by Subhash Chandra Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru, and linkage with Motilal Nehru. This dimension of the subterranean level of the linkage between the revolution at that time and the Congress, that this was not pursued by researchers and explorers, was perhaps one of the effects of this impact, the legacy of the Ghadar movement. Self-sacrifice, passion, emphasis on individual heroism. So this, obviously, it's the culture which conditions the culture, what Bhagwan Josh calls cultural internality. This becomes a reason for a particular kind of a legacy. The legacy is not, in a sense, only what is given, but it's also in a sense of what is taken by the others. This frame of mind as to what would you take from the study of the other movement makes for this impact. There is another dimension also I wanted to touch, but I don't have the time. This is with reference to the claim that this movement was secular. Actually, when you talk about collaboration between different communities, Hindus and Muslims and Pathans and all of us, let us get together. This does not mean actually collaboration of people who are thinking in terms of distinct communities doesn't make for secularism. This again is kind of an escape. That is how our section of people would call that we in India are following Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. You have a distinct philosophy of hatred for the other, and you believe. Now, this kind of feeling that we are aware that we believe in Vasudhaiva. We are aware that we believe in secularism. But actually, we know that when we look to the path of, let us say, Barkatullah, Ubaidullah, Hardyal, Bhai Parmanand, to which direction did they go? You had Manguram coming out and starting their own Adhara movement. So this secularism, it was believed that this Sikh basically is secular. Bhakna, for example, said, Asli Sikh ta meri jache sacha manavadi te niklabi hunda. So that, Sikhs are by nature secular. And the result was that in Punjab, in particular, you think of the Sikh communist, Muslim, and you talk of Muslim communist. And because of that fuzziness, they became supporters of, let's say, the communist supporters of the Sikh homeland. They had the whole plan Adhikari prepared, in the support of even Pakistan. So this kind of the fuzziness about what really secular means is one part of the heritage we have of the Ghadar movement. I think I should stop here and say that the impact of Bhagat Singh even today is in the nature of the influence which Ghadar movement had on the mind of Bhagat Singh. And the tendency to seriously grapple with the problems. The problem in India, for example, what we face today, the level of degeneration of thinking in the minds of men, vast scale, what Hannah Arendt would call the banality of evil. This kind of phenomenon which is happening, how do we confront it? It requires serious kind of thought. But if you are inspired only by the idea of militancy, self-sacrifice, personal valor, personal courage, that is not really the route to confronting the reality with reason. So rationality and reason become secondary when this kind of passion for some kind of narcissism also actually in this. And this continues in Punjab in particular, and that is part of the reason that the Punjabis really do not take to Gandhi very kindly. They have the whole thinking is that here was an effeminate kind of a person. What we need is masculine, muscular kind of movements. And Gandhi doesn't really fill the bill. With these words, I'll say thank you very much indeed I don't know how far I've been able to explain things, but that is how I could do it. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, Harish, for this very interesting, rich and erudite discussion. I was particularly taken with your comments about how in some ways the Ghadar movement was a success, and in some ways it failed, and why it failed. And your comparisons with Bhagat Singh, I think, were really quite striking and quite interesting. And I think that really brings us to Professor Indu Bunga and her historical perspective. And I'd like her to pick up either on that or any other aspect of Harish's talks and put it in further historical context. Professor Bunga. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute.
Mute, Carlo.
Click the unmute button. There you go.
Well, I think I'm now unmuted. Thank you, Professor Juergensmeyer. It's always an honor to be part of the programs of Bhai V. Singh Sahitya Sadan. And it's generally a very learning experience for me personally, as it has been the present one too. And the Sadan, I have long felt, bridges the Punjabi scholarship all over the world. And this particular program is a very good example of that. Because in one sense, we would regard Professor Juergensmeyer a Punjabi and very much a Punjabi, and therefore I think my observation should be taken in its right spirit. Professor Puri, as always, I've listened to him so many times on this particular theme, but every time there is something new to learn from him, from his lecture, and this was no exception. He touched upon several aspects, and I particularly found this reference to the mutiny papers being a must study for the British officers, administrators coming down to India. I can very well imagine their psychology, their mentality, those who were in India at that time, especially during the war years, and how, what kind of impact Dyer would have had on interacting with the British families in Amritsar or elsewhere. And I was just a little surprised that Professor Puri didn't make a mention of O. Dwyer. Of course, O. Dwyer would also fall in that category, very much so, which is there by implication. And I'm reminded of the earnest defense of Dyer by O. Dwyer till the death of Dyer, and then also his efforts at raising a memorial to Dyer. And then his crucial role in founding the Empire India Society, which was a group of conservative politicians, and Churchill also became a member of that society. So these people, and with the kind of psyche O. Dwyer had, probably Dyer and O. Dwyer virtually supported each other in terms of the outcome we had in the Jallianwala Bagh. I just thought of mentioning this point because I happened to study O. Dwyer in the context of Ripudaman Singh of Nabha. So it just occurred to me to share with you. This point of impact on Bhagat Singh and the revolutionaries is extremely well taken. And this idea that Bhagat Singh and revolutionaries would like to first prepare the masses, have some kind of organization, before they could think of striking at the roots of the British Empire. And then listening to Professor Puri, it occurred to me, of course, I mean, we all know this, but maybe we need to remind ourselves that each historical character, and a character like Bhagat Singh, even if he had a short life of 23 years, but especially because he was so active and he was so prolific in his writings, needs to be seen historically. Historically, in the sense of an evolving person in an evolving situation. The mind was evolving all the time is in response to a fast changing situation. And generally what happens is that in our history textbooks, we have one set view of the Ghadar movement and also almost a set view of Bhagat Singh. And Bhagat Singh passed through several kinds of states. I mean, he was evolving, he was growing all the time, he was reading all the time and reading a lot while in jail. So all that contributed to the development of his thinking and his strategy or his vision of the future of India. So we may, as we generally do, historians do, but most people do not, to break Bhagat Singh into phases, which of course came out very clearly from Professor Puri's presentation. And I'm always struck by the values the Ghadar movement stood for, to which Professor Puri made reference several times. In fact, value of freedom, value of nationalism, combined with that of democracy, of self-sacrifice, of heroism. It's something that we need to cherish today and for the future of India, a future of mankind, you can say. Listening to Professor Puri about Ghadarites looking upon themselves as Hindi outside, as Indians outside, of course, when we go out of India, we generally think of ourselves as Indians. In their case also, this conscious self-identification as Hindi would be as much because of this general phenomena as because of the situation in which they were placed historically at that time. Otherwise, we all have multiple identities, as you know. You did make a brief reference to the Sikh ideology towards the end, but listening to you, I was wondering how much of their consciousness actually is not what Pakna says, Baba Son Singh Pakna says, but what actually is coming out of Sikh ideology, to which Professor Puri has made a reference in another of his articles, but I thought that needs to be emphasized. Then, since I made reference to failure, or Professor Puri made a reference to failure, the textbook view of the Ghadar movement, when I first read about it, I'm reminded of Khushwant Singh's, relatively speaking, a very good chapter on xenophobic Marxism. And Professor Juergensmeyer probably had much to do with that. But we all have been talking about the failure of the movement. I was wondering if we could say, this is maybe a little unconventional to say, that in one sense, all movements for India's freedom failed. In one sense. India did not get freedom because of any particular movement, but in another sense, each made a dent in the strong position of the British and in the consciousness of the people. So it is the cumulative effect of these movements that led to the freedom of India. So therefore, I find not that we can help it. In conventional terms, we have to talk in terms of quote unquote failure. But to my mind, Ghadar movement or any such movement was bound to be a failure in conventional terms, but it was a great success in terms of its impact, in terms of its legacy. And I think I should stop here and look forward to listening to Professor Juergensmeyer, because it's rarely that you have two eminent scholars on the same theme in one lecture, one as the speaker and the other as the chair. Thank you very much.
And the third is a commentator. Thank you so much, Professor Bunga, for particularly those closing words about how, though in some ways the Ghadar movement was a failure, it was also a part of a larger success. And that, of course, is what your historical perspective helps to provide for us to see this larger trajectory. I was impressed with so many different things about Professor Puri's remarks, but I couldn't help thinking when he was talking about the sort of boldness of these young people and their sense of identity, the degree to which, as Professor Bunga also said, their being foreigners in a foreign land helped to shape and encourage this development. Because there's really a very interesting phenomenon about what happens to people when they get outside of their own country. We're thinking of Sun Yat-sen, who then came back to China, or Ho Chi Minh, who then came back to Vietnam. And in some ways, the Ghadarites became not really global citizens, but they became nationalists in a different kind of way by not being in their nation. It's an interesting phenomenon. Being an American, I would like to think that they came to America and they were so charmed by the equality and freedom that they experienced here that they wanted to bring it back to India. Unfortunately, that was not the case. They were treated very miserably in the United States and Canada. And they had every reason to despise the kind of society and the politics that would allow them to be treated so badly. So I don't think it's that, but rather the very fact of being together, of all, as Professor Bunga said, all, when you're out of the country, you feel like you revive your national identity in a way that you don't when you're in the nation. I never celebrate the 4th of July in the United States, but I remembered in India proudly going to the American embassy and eating hot dogs and playing baseball and doing all these American things and feeling very American. And I'm sure the Ghadarites in some ways felt the same, getting a sense of identity of being foreigners in a foreign land and also being emboldened by that. And that may have led to the kind of quixotic nature of the movement that Professor Puri talked about, a kind of romantic militancy without much strategy involved in it, much thinking about the consequences of it, being foreigners and thinking, being in some ways empowered by that distance, and by being together as a united team in a far off land, thinking that their sheer will and their sheer actions could transform a subcontinent. I mean, what remarkable chutzpah that was. And yet, as Professor Bunga said, it made its mark. It was one of the first movements for India's independence. A flag briefly flew for an independent India in San Francisco in California, in part because of the Ghadarites. So they made their mark, and we are continuing to talk about them today because they had an inspiration, and they had a will, they had a drive, and they had a love of country that still impacts us today. Well, this has been a very rich discussion. I wish we could keep on talking all night. Unfortunately, it is late at night for me, even though it's the middle of the day for you. But I want to thank you very much, Professor Puri, for your wonderful presentation, Professor Ndubongo for your fine comments, and Mahinder Singh for bringing us all together. Once again, it's been truly a family reunion. Thank you all very much. This has been a wonderful evening.
Thank you, friends. I learned something different from Professor Puri. Under the influence of Professor Bipin Chandra, I thought Bhagat Singh and Gandhi, they were not on the same thinking. But this, I think this is a revealing, and one needs to work, that Bhagat Singh was not all that opposed to non-violence. Anyway, new aspect which needs to be studied. We have two announcements to make. In the Punjab lecture series, the next lecture is on Friday, 25th March at 5 p.m. by Professor Mridula Mukherjee, Punjabi peasantry's contribution towards freedom movement from Pagdi Sambhal Jatta to this Kisan movement. And Professor Sucha Singh Gill, who is in Canada at the moment, but he'll be able to join us to chair. And in between, on the 9th March, we have a talk by Harinder Singh from Sikh Research Institute, US. That is on Naam Daan Isnan. So if you can find time, please join us. And with these words, I thank you again. You managed to make it on from different areas and some friends from short notice. And my apologies to Professor Harish Puri. He couldn't study. He has so much, studied so much. That's the problem. If you know so much, how do you sort of concise? So maybe we'll have another lecture by him. He can sort of, last aspect, I'm really impressed. Gandhi and Bhagat Singh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Nice recovery, Mark. Get well soon and come to India.
Best
so
wishes
much.
to you, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot, Professor Banga. Liked your comments because, you know, all the three things you pointed out about O'Dwyer and the cumulative effect